Hello and welcome back to the Münster podcast. I'm your host Charles, as always, and today on this episode we will be looking at the life of Asa Philip Randolph, an incredibly important figure in modern African American civil rights, and is often somebody who is not known despite how important he was. I'm going to start a kind of sort of series in the Munster podcast about biographies of different historical figures that I personally find incredibly interesting and that I would like to share their life story with you. So we'll start with the first person, Asa Philip Randolph, who was born on April the 15th, 1889 in Crescent City, Florida. Now in 1891 the family moved to Jacksonville, inside Florida, which had a very thriving, well-established African American community. Now, his father was a tailor and a minister who taught him from a young age that race was not an important factor when judging a person's character, and his mother was a skilled seamstress and emphasized to Randolph that education was incredibly important. And as a result of these two things, we see the two main characteristics of Randolph. He became an incredibly hard-working student and attended the Cookman Institute in East Jacksonville, the only academic high school in Florida for African Americans. Randolph's best subjects were literature and drama, but he also starred in the school's baseball team, a real academic. After graduating, Randolph worked odd jobs and spent his free time singing, acting, and reading. Unable to further his career in the South, where African Americans were limited to only manual labor, he moved to New York City in 1911. When he arrived, he began taking social science courses at City College. After reading W.E.B. Du Bois' book, The Souls of Black Folk, Randolph became convinced that the fight for social equality was the most important. Around this time, he was introduced to socialism through the various trade unions present in New York. In 1913, Randolph married Lucille Campbell Green, an entrepreneur and Howard University graduate who shared his socialist politics. After their marriage, Randolph actually aimed to pursue his dreams of becoming an actor, and he organized the Shakespearean Society in Harlem, where he played the star roles of Hamlet, Othello, and Romeo. However, despite his best efforts, he gave up on becoming an actor after failing to win his parents' approval. In New York, Randolph met Chandler Owen, a Columbia University law student who argued that people could only be free if not subject to economic deprivation. This encounter established Randolph's ideology and formed the foundations for his distinctive form of civil rights activism, which made him so famous. His methods were to emphasize the importance of collective action in order for African Americans to gain legal and economic equality. Randolph and Owen collaborated in opening an employment office in Harlem to provide job training for Southern African American immigrants and encouraging them to join trade unions. In 1917, Randolph and Owen founded the radical magazine, The Messenger, which spoke out against lynching, American involvement in World War I, and also urged African Americans to resist the draft, fight for an integrated society, and also to join trade unions. Unfortunately for Randolph, the Messenger declined after a lack of financial support due to infighting within the company. In 1920, Randolph ran on the Socialist Party ticket for New York State Comptroller, and in 1922 he ran for Secretary of State, but unfortunately was unsuccessful both times. Randolph first became involved with trade unions in 1917. This began a successful career in labor union campaigning that would make him incredibly famous. In 1917, Randolph organized a union of elevator operators, and in 1919 he became president of the National Brotherhood of Workers of America, a union which organized African American shipyard and dock workers in Virginia. These projects were tiny in comparison to his greatest achievement, which came around the mid-1920s. In 1925, he was elected the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The union was the first major effort to form a union for employees of the Pullman Company, which was a large employer of African Americans. With Randolph as president, the Union hoped to improve the poor working conditions of porters. The Union enrolled over half of all porters within a year of its founding, but Pullman responded with violent shakedowns and they fired many workers. Randolph planned a strike in response to the difficult negotiations, but the strike was postponed when Pullman revealed that it had 5,000 workers in reserve to take the place of the union members. Due to the perceived ineffectiveness of the BSCP, membership declined, and by 1933 the union appeared to reach its breaking point. In 1935, the Railway Labour Act was amended, with porters now being granted extra rights. Membership of the BSCP rose to more than 7,000 from 658. After years of protest, the Pullman Company finally opened negotiations with the union and agreed on a contract in 1937. Employers gained massive benefits such as overtime pay and shorter working hours. After the success in trade unions, Randolph turned to African American civil rights. He was inspired by Gandhi's peaceful protests in India and wanted to protest against discrimination in industry, segregation, and also wanted to propose an anti-lynching law. Randolph's movement began to gain momentum. In 1942, 18,000 African Americans gathered at Madison Square Garden to hear Randolph's speeches. Randolph was able to put considerable pressure on President Truman to end segregation in the military. Truman, realizing he needed the support of the growing African American population in the North, abolished racial segregation in the armed forces through Executive Order 9981. In 1950, Randolph founded the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, a major civil rights coalition. It coordinated campaigns on behalf of every major civil rights law. Later, Randolph formed an important alliance with the famous Martin Luther King Jr. Randolph helped King organize the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom in 1957 in protest to schools resisting integration following the Brown v. Board ruling. In 1958 and 1959, Randolph organized marches in Washington, D.C. to promote the integration of African Americans in schools. Randolph aimed to form alliances with liberal white Americans and taught King how to organize peaceful demonstrations to help gain support. King and Randolph helped organize protests in Birmingham and Montgomery, which saw violent backlash by police and the Ku Klux Klan. The events which unfolded was used by propaganda by the Soviet Union and became an international embarrassment for the United States. President Kennedy began drafting civil rights legislation aiming to end Jim Crow laws because of this humiliation, signaling another victory for Randolph. Randolph's grand vision finally became true on August the 28th, 1963, during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The famous rally is often remembered as the moment Martin Luther King Jr. defined his career, but the campaign was organized mainly by Randolph and centered around his methods of protest. Around 300,000 people gathered for the march and helped convince President Kennedy to pass the Civil Rights Act. In 1964, President Johnson awarded Randolph with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest award a civilian can get. In 1979, Randolph passed away after a recurring heart problem eventually killed him. Randolph had a huge impact on African American civil rights, a figure often forgotten in the shadows of Martin Luther King Jr. Randolph is a highly underappreciated person in African American civil rights history. His tactics were used by African American campaigners across the nation, and his peaceful ideas became the foundation for all future protesters in his era. That has been the Münster podcast. I've been your host, Charles. Hope you found this very short episode quite interesting about what is a really influential and important figure in not just African American history, but American history as a whole. Randolph had a massive impact on protest methods, and we can largely credit Randolph for the peaceful protests that we saw conducted by Martin Luther King Jr. So let's not forget Randolph here. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you next time.